All right, so he has a book out right now. It's called We the Poison, exposing the Flint Water Crisis Cover-Up and the poisoning of 100,000 Americans. Please welcome to the show author Jordan Chariton. How are you, brother?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Great to be here. Glad you're here. Thank you so much. For those who may not be familiar with you, Jordan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where our listeners can find you?
Yeah, independent journalist, do kind of the dirty work, I guess, that the media doesn't cover. So I'm out on the ground quite a bit, covering stories like Flint, covering worker strikes, economic struggle. Done a few reporting tours in recent years, focused on poverty, homelessness, worker strikes, union organizing, and frankly, environmental corruption in Flint, East Palestine, Ohio, and many other places. And you can find my work on Status Coup. That's COUP, Status Coup on YouTube.
All right, all those links will be below in the description so you guys can click it and support Jordan wherever he's at. Jordan, thanks for doing this topic for us. I really do appreciate it, and it's so crazy. The news cycle is just so unrelenting that I just feel that things get memory hold so quickly. And we have so much focus on everything going on around the world, whether it's Ukraine, Gaza, whatever the conflict it might be, that we forget so much of what's going on here on the ground in our own country. How did you get started on this topic? Like, what brought you to this?
Yeah, I mean, I was with the Young Turks in 2016, which is back then pretty big outlet, still pretty big. And I was covering the 2016 election, so I was bopping around, Bernie rallies, Trump rallies, and all the madness between those two things. And in the summer of 2016, I kind of like knew about Flint. I knew what happened, but I guess I was naive, like a lot of other people, and I just figured the government has to be fixing this, right? I mean, they're waiting online for water in Flint. And I was at a conference, and someone from Flint came up to me. She was wearing a Flint Lives Matter shirt, and she basically begged me to come to Flint. And she told me that it was a just disaster still, that after the media covered it for 5 minutes, they left, and it was just a mess, and nobody was doing anything, and the government was trying to cover it up, and kids had rashes, and people were losing their hair from the water. So I got my boss, to his credit, sent me there. So I went there for the first time in 2016 over the summer, and that was pretty much after all the cameras had gone. And I had never really been in that situation. I grew up on Long Island. I had some issues, but not water. And I was just blown away. I mean, I was seeing front porches with cases of bottled water, up to the top. I was seeing kids with rashes. I remember one home, one of the first I went into, everything was broken, the washing machine, the dishwasher, the laundry
Unbelievable.
machine, from the water, just toxic water. And it was that kind of first trip. I remember I went back to the hotel, and it was just this alternative reality, seeing, I think it was CNN. They were like covering whatever Trump tweeted and all that nonsense. And I'm here like, people are literally being poisoned, and it's already been swept under the rug. So that was my first trip, and I kind of just from there got the bug to stay on it. And at first, I really just wanted to focus on the human part. People were suffering. But very quickly, it became clear to me that this was a real corruption scandal. And 8 years later, and I've been there 21 times, I think, obviously I'm pretty biased because I covered it, but I think it's the biggest cover-up, in the government cover-up in the 21st century. I think it makes Watergate look like child's play. Nobody died during Watergate. And unfortunately, it's in part been able to go on for 10 years because, contrary to the media spin, it's still a disaster. The water's still bad 10 years later. And part of that is because the media just stopped covering it years ago.
I am so thankful for people like you. These are the stories that need to be covered, and I hate to put it this way, but these aren't the sexy stories that get you the clicks, that get you, front page of this newspaper and front page of this newspaper. It's not sensationalized. that, that everyone's talking about it, the retweets and all that stuff. And like, there's this real debate about, is journalism dead? And then I meet people like you and I realize it's really strong. It just had to go super indie because that's the only way it gets done, and like so many of these, whether I don't care what side of the spectrum you're on, there's these giant like corporations that control our information. And if a story gets too close to their bottom line, it never gets covered. And
Yep.
so I really do appreciate everything that you do. So thank you very much. So, it's very interesting. You brought up Bernie. I talk about it all the time. This show was inspired by Bernie and Hillary and the primaries and all that stuff. And I decided to talk about it. And we're hearing this again in this election, that democracy is on the line. It's all about democracy and all that stuff. So, like, when you study any of this, like, what do you think about, like, there's this hysteria about, our sacred democracy being on the line. What have you learned about that? Like, what do you think about the state of democracy in America right now?
It would be lovely if we had a democracy, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I just hear that. Not to say that there's not major issues and whatever. I mean, it doesn't matter to me who your audience likes. I think both candidates, frankly, are terrible. But I think Flint, frankly, shows we don't really have a democracy. And if you want to know, like, a real example of democracy being removed rather than the media and the politicians just fear-mongering, Flint is actually a prime example of what happens when democracy is removed. So quick lesson in history. In 2011, nationally, the country was still kind of suffering from the financial crash. Flint was just like I say in the book, it was like a rotting economic corpse for a lot of reasons, for decades. Places like Flint, Detroit had really been falling apart economically. And the Republican governor came in. He ran on, running government like a business, which is never a great idea. And he declared a financial emergency, which at the time I didn't hear, Rachel Maddow and all those folks, huffing and puffing about democracy. I didn't really hear them saying anything at that time. And what that meant was basically he waved a wand and he took over the rule of cities like Flint. So he appointed unelected emergency managers, I call them czars, to just take over power from the elected mayor, from the elected city council. So they were just kind of puppets at this point. And these unelected people that the voters didn't vote for, these people were basically doing the bidding of the governor. It wasn't just in Flint. They did it in Detroit and a couple other cities that were majority black. And their first order of business, basically, this is like basically the governor becoming king of the local cities. The first order of business was, let's try and privatize the water system. And the water in Michigan is some of the greatest in the world. It's the Great Lakes. So if people don't know, 20% of the water of the world's fresh water comes from the Great Lakes.
What?
Yeah. And so Flint had gotten its water from the city of Detroit for like 50 years. It came out of Lake Huron, which is one of those Great Lakes, and Detroit sent it in a water pipe to Flint. And there was no like water problems quality-wise. But long story short, Detroit was price gouging Flint. So local officials and this new emergency manager, which was basically just doing the governor's bidding, said, wouldn't it be a great idea to create a totally redundant copycat pipeline that went the same exact route as the existing pipeline, and we'll just have our own water system that would be basically privatized. Detroit's pipeline was public, so there's more regulations. And they basically created this duplicative pipeline.
Oh my God.
In theory, to save money for the residents of Flint, but it was actually never about saving money because at the last minute, the city of Detroit, which Flint was its biggest water customer. If the city of Detroit lost Flint, it was going to go belly up, the water department. So they offered the city of Flint basically like a half-off discount to stay. So like you go to the store, half off. Pretty good deal. And the unelected emergency manager, again, democracy, the unelected emergency manager passed on that because it was never about making money. They just wanted a privatized water system. They moved to this new system, but that was going to take 2 years to build. So during the construction period, the city of Flint could have just kept getting water from Detroit in that short term, but they said, well, why don't we save money by using our river, which had been dumped in General
Oh my
Motors,
God.
Dow Chemical, DuPont, every corporate, in my view, criminal had dumped its shit in the Flint River for 100 years. Like the residents in Flint, they used to joke like that's where the bodies are. That's where they dump the bodies, the Flint River. And they also, in addition to the polluted river, said, why don't we use the skeleton plant? Because it hadn't been used as a full-time water plant in 50 years. I say, like, to bring it to today, it's like these Boeing planes that are falling apart in air. That's like the Flint water plant. I have a whole chapter. Like, they didn't even have all the equipment at the time that they switched to the Flint River to treat the water. So it's basically a privatization scheme. The media always reports it as this was a tragedy to save money. It wasn't to save money. It's a lot of people who were trying to make money off of poor people in Flint. And obviously, we know what happened. They got poisoned.
That is such a you hear this story over and over again. Like in Los Angeles, we have a giant subway system that they will not use because they can't make money off of it. So they want to build a whole new thing. Everything's about cashing checks the whole time. Nobody's making it. Nobody's doing what's best for the people. That is shocking to me. Now you screw two cities over. You're screwing Detroit over, and you're screwing Flint over. This is mind blowing to me. And it's just like when, yeah, everybody thinks privatized. We see that in our military right now. So many of these militias we send over, they're all privatized. They're costing way more money than our regular military would cost, and they don't have to play by the rules of war because they're privatized military. It's like it's so shocking to me. Everything is about money. It's really sad too. It's really sad the way Michigan is being treated and forgotten. It's mind blowing to me, and it makes me really sad, man. So you go down there, you get pulled in, and you instantly start to realize that there's something way bigger going on here, right? Way bigger. It's not just about dirty water, but it's like a corruption at a level that maybe you had never seen or anyone's ever seen. Can you tell us a little bit about that? About, like why is this Flint water situation worse than Watergate or any of these other like scandals that seem to grab our attention?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't really care what you are. I mean, everyone's got their blue hat on or their red hat on politically. I think we could all agree like water is the most important thing in life. If you don't have it for like
100%.
4 or 5 days, like you're going to die. And if you drink bad water or you bathe in toxic water, you won't die right away, but it could give you cancer and a whole lot of other things. So to me, that was what stood out to me right away when I was there. Like, I mean, this is life or death. This is not like, arguing about all the bullshit people argue about on Twitter and TikTok and whatever else. But yeah, I mean, it was very eye-opening to me because when I was in Flint, the residents, I was really like one of the only journalists still on it, including local reporters. So to the residents, I was kind of like, they were just dumping shit in my lap. I mean, complaints about the private foundation there that was involved, complaints about this politician and that corporation. So it was very like, it almost made you dizzy because I didn't even know where to start because this was like a corruption scandal really that started in the 2000s. But what right away didn't smell right to me was, I mean, when they were building this new water system, Flint was broke. Like Flint was almost bankrupt. So Flint in 2013, 2014, when there was talk about should Flint stay with Detroit or should Flint join this new water system, it wasn't allowed to borrow any more money legally. So this water system, they basically, the county, which Flint is part of, they were like the guarantor, like they were the backstop for payment. And to get the bonds for this water system, so basically to get the money from the banks to build it on the front end, they didn't have enough. So they needed Flint, they needed another city basically to borrow $100 million to help them,
Oh my God.
finish the construction, because the construction was going to cost about 250 million. It's almost 300 million. So to me, I was like, how does a broke city that's nearly bankrupt, that legally can't borrow any more money, how are they allowed to borrow $100 million to fund this completely scam, unnecessary new water system? So the more I dug, I realized that essentially what happened was a just straight up boondoggle. Flint, which had no credit rating, and this is all in my book, they would be allowed to borrow money in the case of an emergency. So basically, the unelected emergency manager, going back to that whole no democracy thing,
Yeah.
local officials, banks, J.P. Morgan and Wells Fargo, they decided, well, why don't we just create an emergency, a fake one? So they created this fake emergency. It was like to clean up this lime sludge pit next to the water plant. And in that agreement, that document, like through the back door in the fine print, they wrote, and Flint could borrow $100 million to help finance this completely. Well, it didn't say that, but to help finance this. So the stated reason was to clean up X, and they just snuck in the back door the real reason for the emergency order, so Flint could join. Basically, without Flint, they couldn't build this unnecessary water system. And in the agreement, they basically put handcuffs on Flint. They said, while this new water system, it was called the Karagandhi Water Authority, KWA, while this new water system is built, Flint has to use the Flint River and has to use the Flint water plant. Well, if you're making them use the Flint River and the Flint water plant, then, well, what happens if there's an issue? Like health-wise, what happens if there's some snafu?
Right.
By law, like according to the agreement, they could not switch back to Detroit's water. And as my reporting progressed, it became clear. I mean, literally within weeks after the water switch was in April 2014. Residents had brown water. Residents had rashes. The EPA was getting calls. So this is not just a state cover-up. The EPA was involved. And it was very clear, like from the jump, that there's a problem with the Flint River. There's a problem with this water switch. The workers at the water plant were begging the powers that be not to switch to the Flint River. And I quote, hell no, this won't work, one of the workers said. But they did it anyway because as part of that deal, remember I said J.P. Morgan and Wells Fargo, they issued the bonds. So Flint borrowed the money, and basically the banks fronted the money to fund this construction. Well, many banks that will say, oh, the residents are poisoned. Yeah, don't worry about paying us back. So basically Flint was already on the hook for a 30-year bond repayment to start paying back the bonds for this completely scam, fraudulent pipeline. So the unelected emergency manager, even when government officials were saying we need to switch back to Detroit, the water's got E. coli in it, the water's got TTHMs, which are cancerous chemicals. He said, no, it'd be too expensive to switch back to Detroit. And basically what he meant is we can't switch back to Detroit because we already got to start repaying the bonds. So every step of the way, it was a balance sheet and money over the residents. And, people like to argue, is it about race? Is it about class? Well, it's both. The residents in Flint, it's a majority black, poor city. There's also a lot of poor white people. There's also immigrants. But the bottom line is they were poor. And right now you got a similar thing going on in East Palestine, Ohio. Norfolk Southern, the multi-billion-dollar railroad company, unnecessarily blew up 5 cars of cancerous chemicals.
What?
And everyone's sick there. And that's a poor white community. And the EPA is covering that up. So poor black, poor white. If you're poor and you're in the wrong place at the wrong time and the government poisons you, good luck. And that's what really pisses me off the most about this because, we have mass shootings in this country and it's covered for 5 minutes and then nobody, they move on. But a city was poisoned. It wasn't some mistake. It wasn't a tragedy. It was an intentional grift, an intentional scam. And the media basically just like regurgitated the bullshit that the EPA, the state government said. They buried it. It's been completely swept under the rug. And people are basically being left to slowly die, cancer is through the roof in Flint 10 years later. You don't hear about it on the news. They haven't even changed the damaged pipes. The water, basically like acid water went through the water pipes for 2 years. They still haven't changed all the pipes. So, yeah, it's a massive scam. And why I say it makes Watergate look like child's play. I mean, at the end of the day, Watergate was a few knuckleheads that broke into an office. Like
Right.
nobody died. Nobody
Right.
died.
Right.
If Nixon wasn't involved, nobody would care. So it's more Watergate is more because the president was involved and the election. But in this is like to me the real Watergate because people are dying. People have died and continue to die because you have toxic water and, in my view, a toxic government that's covering it up.